Darkfire Audio presents Call of the Herald, Book 1 in the Dawning of Power trilogy, written by Brian Rathbone, narrated by Chris Snellgrove. Chapter 19. Belief systems are fragile things. How will you react when your reality suddenly ceases to exist? Ein Geist, Sleepless One.
You ride with me,
Vertuk said, giving Catrin no choice but to follow him to his horse. They would all ride on horses with the other men, whose saddles contained a second set of passenger flaps that held soft leather stirrups. The flaps provided little cushion, but they had a large ridge around the back that would help keep them in place when they were riding at speed. Before Catrin could get her boots into the stirrups firmly, Vertuk issued a battle cry and the horse leaped into a full gallop. Catrin grabbed at the leather straps that hung from the sides of the saddle and held on with white knuckles, struggling to get her boots in the stirrups. Once her boots were firmly planted, she settled into the rhythm of the horse's powerful stride. Vertuk's eyes showed his pleasure that the herald had such fine riding skills. The riders sent clouds of dust into the wind, and Catrin squinted to keep sand from her eyes. Vertuk reached into his saddlebag and produced a headgear for Catrin, this time one with eye slits. She felt a little unsteady as they rode, but it was much better than sand in her eyes. Cheslow and the others rode in tight formation with Vertuk, and Catrin saw her companions donning headgears as well. Like a flash flood, they rolled toward the valley entrance in a headlong rush, lest they become trapped. The mouth of the valley was narrow, and the horsemen funneled together, close enough for Catrin to touch the rider beside her, and as they passed through the narrow opening, they smashed together, nearly unhorsing her. Clear of the valley, tribesmen surrounded their leaders in a tight diamond-shaped formation. Vertuk directed them straight toward the line of Jean's soldiers approaching from the north. The wind whipped and visibility dropped to near zero. The Jean were obscured by a veil of dust and were barely visible along the horizon. Despite greater numbers, the Jean attacked seemed ill-advised. They were still distant and spread thin, but Catrin supposed their hands had been forced when the Argast intercepted their prey. Had the Argast been less vigilant, she would have been trapped. She turned her head to see who was behind her, but she could see little through the headgear and the dust that roiled up behind them. As she gazed higher, she could still see the top of the towering fountain, and she was amazed to see a pair of eagles floating on the thermals in the mist surrounding it. They swooped and dived through the water, and Catrin felt a moment of vindication and joy. The Argast remained true to the straight path they had chosen, and the enemy forces seemed to be gauging their purpose. As the Jean formed into a more dense and organized force, Catrin shouted to Vertuk, telling him to take evasive action, but he continued on his direct course. Looking at the dense formation of Argasts surrounding her, she wondered if Vertuk planned to ride straight through the gathering Jean. The closer they came to the Jean, the more prepared the enemy appeared, looking ready to stand fast against the approaching onslaught. Many soldiers dismounted and held long pikes to protect against the charge, but by concentrating in one area, they committed themselves to holding that ground. Vertuk raised a reverberating cry, and riders charged in every direction, forcing the Jean to abandon the ground they held. Catrin held on tight as Vertuk turned his mount sharply and headed east. The Argast horses were winded, but so were those carrying the Jean. The Jean horses had not been desert-bred and were on unfamiliar turf. Catrin looked around desperately for her guardians, but the headgears and the dust made it nearly impossible to identify anyone. Vertuk's gambit proved a temporary advantage, but hordes of Jean reinforcements began to flood the desert, swarming around isolated pockets of the Argast. One of the tribal leaders rode in close, and Catrin heard Nat shouting and pointing northeast. "To the cliffs! Must get Catrin to the cliffs!" Vertuk nodded and angled them in the direction Nat indicated. No matter which direction they chose, they would have to break through the Jean at some point, and Vertuk veered for the largest gap in their lines. In the same instant, Nat cried out a warning. Catrin snapped her gaze to where he pointed, and Vertuk cursed when he spotted a formation of soldiers closing in from the north. These men and their horses wore protective gear, making them much better prepared for desert fighting. The horses showed a bit of lather, but did not appear as winded as the horse beneath Catrin. Vertuk shouted and turned east, pushing their mount to the limit. Catrin was humbled by the dedication and courage of the Argast horses, who gave all they had. Feeling such affection and gratitude for the mount that was so valiantly bearing her and Vertuk, she placed her hand on the horse's croup behind the saddle, and, unaware, her emotions, love, peace, and energy, flowed from her hand into the horse. As she touched him, her hand grew hot, and a tingling pulsated in her palm. The horse seemed to respond to her gentle touch and was rejuvenated. It leaped ahead of the horses surrounding it. Vertuk slowed his mount to let the others make up the ground he had gained. The approaching Jean formed into a tight wedge and closed at great speed, making Catrin wonder if this was where the fighting would truly begin. It was terrifying, and she could not envision it. The tension in the air was palpable, and she could hear little above the muted thunder of hooves pounding the sand. No one spoke, shouted, or cried out. It was eerie and unnerving, and Catrin could feel the hair on her arms and neck stand on end. The approaching Jean were mostly armed with swords, but a few carried bows. The Argast were armed with wooden spears, and they looked puny beside the cold iron. Vertuk desperately sought to evade the menacing wedge, but it continued to grow closer. The low din was shattered when the Jean overtook them, cries of man and horse ringing above the muted thunder, accompanied by metal striking hardened wood. Catrin ducked under a sword as it whistled by her head and was still off balance when a soldier slammed his mount into hers. She was nearly knocked from the saddle by the impact and leaned out perilously to one side as Vertuk smashed the soldier across the face with the butt of his spear. As she straightened in the saddle, Catrin caught a glimpse of Cheslo and Benjen. She screamed as she saw them collide at full speed with a Jean soldier. She watched in horror as all three went down, and she was unable to distinguish anything in the chaos. The Jean were trying to divide the Argast to deal with them individually, and they were doing an alarmingly good job of it. Vertuk and Catrin were forced away from the others and found themselves surrounded by Jean. Riding behind a man whose name he did not know and whose dialect he did not seem to speak, Chase watched Benjen go down. He thought he saw Catrin nearby. A Jean soldier was bearing down on Benjen, and at the same time, at least a dozen were going after Catrin. Time seemed to slow as Chase was torn by a decision that must be made in an instant. There was no time for debate or second thoughts. He yanked on the shoulder of the man in front of him, pointing and screaming, and by the mercy of the gods, the tribal leader turned his horse toward where Benjen had fallen. Chase cursed and climbed to one side of the horse. Putting his right leg in the left stirrup, he coiled his muscles like a snake about to strike. An instant before a Jean blade would take Benjen's life, Chase jumped. Osborne cried out as one of his boots slipped from the stirrup. Only Spenoir's firm grip kept him from tumbling to the sand. Riders came from all directions, and it was difficult to tell friend from foe, but when a horse materialized from the dust bearing two riders, he knew it was one of his friends. Strom roared as they passed, throwing what looked like a pear at an oncoming Jean horse. The fruit struck the horse in the forehead, startling the animal while it was at full gallop. The horse and its helpless rider veered sideways and crashed into another Jean soldier. Osborne would have cheered the victory, but more riders came, and he followed Strom's lead. He opened one of the pouches along the saddle and found soft cheeses wrapped in broad, supple leaves. Knowing they would have no need for food if they did not first escape, he took half of them and began throwing them at approaching Jean riders. Though he was aiming for the horse's eyes, he often missed, but one bundle of cheese struck a Jean soldier in the face and exploded on impact. The blinded soldier dropped his reins and tried to clear the cheese from his eyes, but the cheese clung to his skin and lashes, and sand began to collect on it, making matters worse. Unprepared when his horse suddenly veered around a fallen rider, the soldier flew from the saddle and plowed face first into the sand. Osborne let out a brief cheer just before a Jean horse struck them broadside and at full speed. As the world tumbled around him, Osborne gave thanks for all that life had given him. Activity to Catrin's right caught her attention, and she turned to see what was happening. The Arghast had adapted quickly and were using the Jean's ramming technique against them. She watched, horrified, as the Arghast crashed recklessly into the Jean. One horse caught her attention as it bowled over an unsuspecting Jean soldier, its second passenger taking down the Jean with his staff. Nat howled, wide-eyed, like a man possessed as he searched for a new foe. Catrin recognized Ervil of the Sun Clan, who rode before Nat. Ervil attacked with a fury, driving his horse into the Jean, thrashing them with his spears and yelling exultantly whenever Nat landed a blow. They cleared a hole in the Jean line just large enough for them to break free. Vertuk and Ervil urged their horses on, and somehow the marvelous beasts found their wind. They surged ahead of the pursuing Jean and thundered toward the rocky borderland where a sparse forest skirted the cliffs. Vertuk let Ervil and Nat lead, since only Nat knew their destination. Catrin could see several Jean closing in from behind. She feared their swords, but the men armed with bows terrified her more. Her back exposed, she felt naked and vulnerable, and continued to watch for arrows. But the archers were out of bow range and had loosed none, which only increased her terror. Skilled archers would not waste arrows on bad shots, and these men seemed prepared to wait. As the land sloped upward, stunted trees grew thick, stinging with their branches, and loose rock shifted under hooves. The trail became as much an adversary as the Jean, and the nearly spent horses struggled with the terrain. A sharp crack sounded from behind, followed by a sickening thud, and as Catrin spun around, she saw a horse go down, its leg shattered. The flailing animal tumbled down the rocks, taking two others and their riders with it. Ervil struggled to outrun the remaining Jean, following a winding path that was barely more than a game trail. Low-hanging branches assaulted them, and brambles clung, biting deep. Catrin counted 4 Jean remaining, and she shouted to Ervil, urging him on, but he was hard-pressed, and despite his best efforts, the Jean were making better time. All they could do was press on as relentlessly as they could. Ervil barked a warning, and Vertuk veered away from a hornet's nest so large it covered the tree that hosted it. Catrin watched as the Jean grew closer to the nest. Then, in one fluid motion, she drew her knives and launched them at the nest. Her old belt knife with the broken tip flew wide, striking only bark. But in the next instant, her Jean blade struck home, exploding the nest into a cloud of paper and enraged hornets. Moving like an angry specter with a shared life, the mass descended on the Jean with unmitigated fury. Cries of man and horse split the air, and Catrin watched, awed but horrified by what she had done. 2 horses went down, and the rest panicked. Some of the hornets overtook Catrin and Vertuk, and their horses surged ahead with renewed energy born of pain. Vertuk had to duck under many branches, and Catrin was nearly unhorsed by leaves that raked her face and a branch that struck her in the forehead. The Jean fell farther and farther behind, and Ervil took full advantage of the situation. He pushed his mount through brush and brambles, and the noble animal lowered his head and pressed on, ignoring his scrapes and many bleeding cuts. Catrin kept a watchful eye on the woods behind them, seeing soldiers moving between the trees, but they were still a good distance back and moving more slowly. The forest thinned and gave way to a rocky incline, beyond which loomed the bluffs, the absolute edge of Catrin's world. Sorely winded, the horses were clearly in no condition to carry them across such terrain. Vertuk and Ervil spoke quietly, and, in a moment, seemed to agree on a difficult decision. First, they dismounted. Then they helped their passengers to the ground. Vertuk and Ervil then did what would have seemed unthinkable in other circumstances. They commanded their horses to go on without them, but it was entirely contrary to the animal's nature, and they stood their ground, confused and agitated. The men persisted, and Catrin watched in anguish as Vertuk chased his horse away with a flick of a switch. The bond shared by Argast and their horses was like mated souls, and it grieved Catrin to witness the scene. The image of these animals, going against their very natures, retreating through the trees, their ears pinned back and their tails tucked, was burned into her senses, and she knew she would never forget it. Nat took the lead and scrambled up the rocks to look over the edge. He scanned the water, pulled a piece of polished metal from his robe, and signaled wildly. Sounds of pursuit grew closer, and Nat searched the water desperately. Then Ervil grabbed him and spun him to the right. A bright signal, not far east of where they stood, was coming from small boats secluded under the shadow of the cliff. Elated, Nat rushed east along the cliffs. Catrin still feared the soldiers would catch them, and Vertuk and Ervil stayed as far from the edge as they could. Suddenly soldiers emerged from the trees, and Catrin saw one of them knock an arrow. Nat ran to a large rock that jutted out over the water. Catrin and Vertuk rushed to join him. When they looked down at the small boats below, the height terrified Catrin, and she turned to retreat. Before she could take a step, however, Ervil cried out and rushed toward the approaching soldiers. He held his ground against a man wielding a sword, but Catrin saw the archer draw and loose his arrow in one smooth motion. She knew where it would strike, even as the archer's fingertips slid from the bowstring. Tears filled her eyes as she turned back to the cliff. Vertuk stood at her side, looking grim and determined. As one, they prepared to meet their deaths, but as they turned to make their final stand, Nat spoke softly.
"I'm very sorry I have to do this,"
he said, and Catrin knew what was about to happen as she felt his hand on the small of her back. She screamed as he pushed her over the edge. Dust and the smell of blood choked Strom as he pulled himself from under the horse that had given its life to save his. Luck had been with him, and he was uninjured. The same could not be said for Maluk, who was under the horse, dead. As Strom stood, his head spun, and the world around him was a blur. After a moment of shock, he recalled the danger and took a sword from the nearby body of a soldier. Before he could even test his swing, a shadowy rider materialized within a cloud of dust and bore down on him with speed. Stepping back and bracing himself, Strom prepared to take a desperate swing. But then he saw it was Chase. Leaning down from his saddle, Chase reached out and grabbed Strom as he passed, barely slowing. Strom grabbed on and leaped up in the saddle behind Chase, and he was glad to see that Chase had stolen a Jean horse. At least it had a bridle and reins.
"Where are the others?"
Strom shouted.
"I don't know. Let's go find them,"
Chase replied as he drove their mount to greater speed.